The threat of terrorism, the fight against ISIL. China's president on his global tour challenges to China's sovereignty in the South China Sea, opening Cuba, Iran's nuclear deal, and the mounting refugee crisis. These are just a few of the stories that had us talking this year and produced some of our favorite conversations here on The Heat. So to help us analyze the year that's passed, we're joined by Wang Guan, CCTV America's chief political correspondent from Bangkok. Pepe Escobar is a columnist for Asia Times Online. Wajahat Ali is a writer and journalist, and Philip Crowther is Washington correspondent for France 24. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Philip, terrorism, unfortunately, again dominated the headlines this year. We had attacks in Lebanon, in Tunisia, in Iraq, here in the United States, and of course those attacks in Paris. But when we look at the response from countries like France, has terrorism and terrorists got to the point where they are now dictating how countries respond, how they shape policy, both foreign and domestic?
Not sure whether they dictate foreign policy, but have a very clear influence on foreign policy. Look at the immediate French reaction, a state of emergency that is still in place in France at this point. That hasn't been seen since the Algeria war, and that was a long time ago after all. Also, pretty much an immediate military reaction on behalf of the French with that volley of airstrikes in Syria as a direct reaction to a terrorist attack that was at least inspired by the Islamic State group, maybe even orchestrated by them. But when we look at the United States, well, it's been more of a measured approach on behalf of the Obama White House. No escalation of the military campaign yet, though there are plans for more or less a military escalation. But if you look at the Republican side, of course, they've had 5 debates already this year among presidential candidates, and they are certainly, their views are certainly being shaped by terrorist attacks in Paris, for example, but also in San Bernardino. And there's a race almost on behalf of the Republican candidates as to who can go to war the quickest, who can go to war the strongest, and who can bomb the largest amounts of people. So there's an immediate reaction in the Republican field, but I think the White House has been pretty restrained throughout this year in terms of how it reacts to terrorist threats directly.
Wajahat, do you think the White House has been restrained? Because when you look at one of the other consequences of terrorism is that it's forced many countries, like the United States, to abandon some very cherished principles, principles of democracy, liberty, freedom, and things like that. We now see torture being practiced in many instances. We see that we're spied upon. It's accepted. It's commonplace.
Racism is accepted. I mean, the White House has been, of course, a bit restrained. I mean, I have to compliment President Obama, at least in his language, when it comes to the response to terrorism. The Republicans, especially every Republican presidential candidate, if you did a drinking game, each time they said radical Islam, I think by the 6th minute you would die of alcohol poisoning. But the framing of the language, especially when it comes to the White House, specifically they're saying violent extremists, because they realize if you make this an absolutist war between the Islam versus the West, you're helping only ISIS. At the same time, however, when we look at Republican presidential candidates especially, there is no restraint. I mean, Muslims are very popular right now. We're so popular that 1.5 billion of us apparently should not be allowed to the United States by Donald Trump. We also have special IDs. Also, there's going to be registration. There's going to be concentration camps. Maybe we'll call it the Trump centers. He can brand it really well. And also when it comes to restraint, also when it comes to domestic, we have problems with they call Mexicans, what are they calling Mexicans now? Rapists and criminals. So the restraint, especially when it comes to language, especially when it comes to minorities, especially when it comes to Muslims, in response to violent extremists both abroad and at home, has not been restrained at all. And unfortunately, I think what we're witnessing and what we're going to witness in 2016 is anger plus frustration plus ignorance being combined together into a Molotov cocktail being used by Republican presidential candidates against the perceived enemy. And the enemy, Anand, is going to be the Mexican immigrant, the Muslim, the violent extremist, and it's going to be women, LGBT, and African Americans. So restraint is not the, if you will, norm right now in American politics, but President Obama, at the very least in his rhetoric, has been balanced.
Sounds like a fun year ahead.
Huh?
Sounds like a fun year ahead.
China bashing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and there's also China bashing and Russia bashing also.
Right, let's go to Pepe in Bangkok. Pepe, the tragedy in Syria continues. In many respects, it got even worse this past year, if that is possible. Thousands of people again left their homes, moving towards Europe. Did we see any serious attempt in 2015 to resolve this crisis?
No, it's impossible. And now we have an absolutely surrealist concoction, this Saudi Arabia-led Islamic coalition of terrorists. It's completely absurd. the ideological matrix of every strand of Salafi jihadism in the world comes from Wahhabi Saudi Arabia and those absolutely wacko imams in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, all over the GCC. So there are two things about what we today call the expanded GWOT, Global War on Terror. It used to be Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda now, they are moderate rebels. We all know that. Jabhat al-Nusra is considered in the Beltway moderate rebels. And the bad Al-Qaeda is the fake caliphate. If you don't confront the extremely ambiguous policies by both Riyadh and Ankara, nothing will be done in Syria. So now we have this attempt at legitimacy by Riyadh with this coalition, of course, which is a coalition inside a coalition, because what they should be doing with the US-led coalition, they are doing nothing, in fact. For months, there has been no direct Saudi involvement, or Emirati for that matter. On the ground is different, because the 4+1 coalition is advancing slowly but surely, and then soon we're going to have, even with the help of the Americans as well, these 3 Syrian Kurd cantons united, and then all hell will break loose again.
Guan, I want to stay with that issue of terrorism, and something that we don't talk about very often is how terrorism affects China. We know that fighters from China have joined ISIL as well. How big is terrorism a threat for China, and how are the authorities in Beijing responding to it?
You know what, Anand, it's very interesting. My French colleague used the word restraint in describing the White House's reactions to the French attacks. Well, at least the president of the US went to the press briefing room and you said in French that he values fraternity, liberty, and equality. But it may sound too harsh, but can you imagine a US president went to the press briefing room and quotes Analects of Confucius to express concerns when there's attacks happening in Xinjiang, northwestern China's Muslim region? But that's exactly what happens. This region has been very restive in the past few years. There are many radicalized groups such as East Turkestan Islamic Movement and the sister network Turkestan Islamic Party. Both have been designated by the State Department as terrorist organizations. And in the past few years, according to our research, it has claimed responsibility for killing between 300 and 400 people and lives. And those organizations have been proven to have ties with ISIS. Lots of Uyghurs fled to Malaysia and then to Turkey, joining their fight. And also when their attacks, the Al-Qaeda would record a video showing support. It also even recruited the top leadership of this East Turkestan Islamic Movement to its organizations. So China feels, by and large, there has been a double standard when the White House, in White House condemnation of terrorist attacks. When there are attacks in the West, of course, those are condemned. When there are attacks in China, White House says, well, China should respect the legitimate concerns of oppositions.
Okay, Wang Guan, I want to stay with you because I want to move on to China and China's role in the world, its emerging role in the world. President Xi Jinping continued his travels this past year. In fact, he's becoming the globe-trotting president. He's gone to more than 30 countries in the almost 3 years that he's been in office. This past year, he came to the United States, of course. He went to Britain as well. He was given a big welcome in Britain. What do you make of all this globe-trotting? What's the aim here?
Well, it looks to us from a Chinese perspective that this new president has been a very confident and assertive president. The thing is, it's really no surprise that China initiated all those economic, business, and political initiatives and all these engagements with the rest of the world, because this time last year, during China's Foreign Affairs Committee work meeting, the Chinese president used a very interesting word in describing China's foreign policy ambition. He said China should 主动谋划积极进取, that is to strategize and reach out to the world proactively. And that is seen as a break, as a departure from Deng Xiaoping's laying low and bide your time sort of foreign policy ambition. That's why we saw on the economic front, the One Belt, One Road initiative and the AIIB to really engage, start from our closest friends, Russia, Pakistan, and also the Central Asian countries where we think we can have a strong partnership. And on the political front, we've been progressing slowly but surely. Chinese military set up a naval base in Djibouti, and also China intensified its anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Eden and UN peacekeeping troops. But one thing that really concerns me is China's soft culture, soft power deficit. According to the 13th five-year plan, for every 100 patent that we import from Europe and the US, we only export 1. So when was the last time you have a Jackie Chan on the big screen in the West? So this is perhaps the thing that China can improve.
Pepe, what did you make of the relationship between China and the United States in 2015? Did that relationship improve? Because we did see some significant differences between the two countries. Tensions rose over issues in the South China Sea. What did you make of it?
Well, the problem is the Pentagon still subscribes to the full spectrum dominance doctrine. And obviously Russia and China are the big impediments, more and more. And the fact that they have a strategic partnership from the point of view of the Pentagon, this is the ultimate nightmare. So these provocations in the South China Sea, which is an issue, I am in Southeast Asia now. This issue is going to be resolved between China and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The problem is ASEAN, they don't have a common policy. So it could be bilateral between China and all these countries concerned within ASEAN, or ASEAN could evolve a common policy. They can't. They've been trying to do this for years, and it's absolutely impossible. So it's going to be, in the end, bilateral between China and Vietnam, China and Malaysia, China and the Philippines. And obviously the Chinese, they have their means of persuasion are not exactly shabby, all right? So in the long run, I would see a solution for the South China Sea being resolved around Southeast Asia. The problem is, of course, the famous freedom of navigation that the US invokes all the time, basically the Pentagon. It's a myth, because there's absolutely freedom, total freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The problem is everybody is building their outposts. Not only the Chinese, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, they start even before. So this is the key point. Obviously, the North China Sea problem as well. In terms of the cyber sphere between China and the US is going to be really, really hard as well. But the problem is the United States, in an electoral year, they obviously they have their eye off the big ball for the next 10, 15, 20 years, which is One Belt, One Road. The new Silk Roads. This is something that I've been following very closely for the past 2 years. This is the big story of the early 21st century. How China is going to organize the building of the integration of Eurasia via One Belt, One Road. And this is the #1 policy. She is directly implicated in everything. They're doing deals all over from Central Asia to Turkey. And this is the big story. And in the US, it doesn't even register.
Right. Wajahat, one other big development in China-US relations, and that came right as the year came to a close, and that is the United States, the White House, approving arms sales to Taiwan.
Right, 1.83 billion.
We went back into another era that was like the Cold War again, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it's a remake, I say right now. I think we should be witnessing Rocky IV remake, right? Russia's a villain again, Iran's a villain again, and now China is always the perpetual rising threat and rising potential. I think Carly Fiorina said that she has 25 years of business experience in China, which makes her an expert in Chinese national security, and that's how she'll help contain it. I've eaten Chinese food for 35 years, so I'm also apparently an expert on Chinese national security. But look, yes, I think that we're going to see this dance for the next probably 10, 20 years between the United States and China. China has risen, right? And they're going to be doing what they've always been done. Each side's going to try to maintain its hegemony. But one silver lining we should mention, Paris conference, both players, United States and China, proactively, taking responsibility and coming together, partnering up through diplomacy and saying this is a climate change problem affecting the world, affecting our nation, affecting our economy, affecting our security, and we both will be responsible and at least work together on maintaining the planet's health. So that's one thing where in this Cold War, if it's reemerging, which probably is, at least they're talking to one another and trying to save the planet, maybe.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. Coming up, more of the stories that made headlines in 2015. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.